No one draws a line from where they are to a ditch and says, that's where I'm headed, right? Nobody does that. If you asked a new graduate what their dreams or plans for their future would be, they wouldn't say, well, I'm going to build a company and hopefully someday be at the center of a scandal, which then gets me fired and imprisoned and to watch my whole company collapse. That's not the plan. If you ask a newly married couple, what are your hopes and dreams for your marriage? They don't say, well, probably 10 years from now, one or both of us will have like a major conflict or affair and our marriage will disintegrate. That's not the plan. That's not the hope. If you asked a newly ordained minister, why are you going into the ministry? They wouldn't say, you know what, I hope to eventually turn people away from God entirely because of my conduct as a pastor or my affair with another employee. Like nobody plans for that to happen. If you asked a new father and said, what do you hope to teach your kids? He will not say, well, probably someday they'll find some history of porn sites on my computer and they might become addicts as well. Right? We laugh or might cry because these are all real situations that nobody plans to end up in, right? No one draws a line from where they are and says, that's my dream, that's my hope. Very few people, I think. Which is why we said last week, it's no good to simply say, I would never do that. I would never do that. The reason we can't say that is because no one thinks they would ever do that. No one plans for that to happen. No one sets out with something new and a dream to end up in catastrophe, a fallout, or an epic fail. That isn't the plan. It's actually why we started talking about this last week, just saying like, it's easy for us maybe to look at the decisions of other people and label the decisions or even the people themselves as foolish, dumb, stupid, immoral, whatever word you want to put, and in a way think, well, that would never be me. I would never do that. Wisdom actually tells us probably most people don't set out to do that. And we actually began last week by saying, you know what, the starting point is to recognize we're all probably a couple of steps away from a decision that we thought we'd never make. In fact, if you ask people who end up in those situations, they would say, I never thought I would be here, or neighbors or friends or whoever would say, I never thought they were capable of that or would do that, as if somehow all along they had planned to do that. That we are all like a regrettable decision, and every one of us has at least one of those, right? Takes a moment to make, but possibly even a lifetime to pay for. And therefore, we have to do more than just say, I would never do that. I actually suggested to you, and if you're new here or you're just jumping into this series, don't worry, we're just starting this conversation. I caught you up in a couple of minutes. And the rest of you are like, well, why'd you take 30 minutes last week to say it? Never mind, okay? Let's just be present, focus. That the better plan, to actually say I would never do that is kind of a poor foundation, because the foundation is I. Like somehow we think my own conviction or my own belief in myself, or simply saying out loud, I would never do that, is somehow enough of a foundation to make sure that we won't. And yet we said, no, I is not the foundation. God actually needs to be our starting point, our foundation, to help us avoid making decisions we thought we'd never make and having a fallout or a regrettable momentary decision that takes a lifetime to pay for. We need a better foundation, and I would never do that is not a good plan. We need a better plan, because if you say, and I would say this to couples all the time in premarital counseling, don't say, I would never cheat on my spouse, because that just tells you won't do anything to avoid it because you think it'll never happen to you. We actually say, I never want to do that. Therefore, I need a plan, right? I never want to end up in this. I never want that to happen to me. I know it's capable. I'm capable of anything. Right? Any of us are. So I never want to end up there. Therefore, I need a plan. And so we're actually going to talk about that these next few weeks. What is a better plan? And even as I say that, probably there's nothing negative about that in your mind, thinking, okay, a better plan. Yeah, no, that sounds positive. That sounds hopeful. And it is. And actually, it is a better plan that can work, that can really help us. But there's one major obstacle to the plan. An obstacle that if we don't deal with up front, we will never actually be able to put a better plan in place. We will never actually have a better foundation. And the obstacle is actually a word that we all think is a very positive thing. And it really is, except that it's the one thing standing between you and a better plan. The obstacle, quite frankly, is me. It's you. But more specifically, it is an F word. An F word. And I want to have us listen to a passage of scripture where this F word is used a few times. You're thinking, I've never read that passage. To help us deal with and sort of get at the obstacle, the main thing we have to deal with if we're going to have a better plan in place. And this portion, we're actually going to be listening to a portion of a letter written by one of the earliest followers of Jesus, one of the most prolific writers in the first century about the life and death and resurrection and actually the ways of Jesus to communities of Jesus followers all over the Middle East, Central Asia. His name is Paul, and I want you to listen as he kind of puts his finger on the thing we need to deal with and wrestle with and understand if we're going to have a better plan.
For you have been called to live in freedom, my brothers and sisters. But don't use your freedom to satisfy your sinful nature. Instead, use your freedom to serve one another in love. For the whole law can be summed up in this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. But if you're always biting and devouring one another, watch out. Beware of destroying one another. So I say, let the Holy Spirit guide your lives. Then you won't be doing what your sinful nature craves. The sinful nature wants to do evil, which is just the opposite of what the Spirit wants. And the Spirit gives us desires that are the opposite of what the sinful nature desires. These two forces are constantly fighting each other, so you're not free to carry out your good intentions. But when you are directed by the Spirit, you're not under obligation to the law of Moses. When you follow the desires of your sinful nature, the results are very clear: sexual immorality, impurity, lustful pleasures, idolatry, sorcery, hostility, quarreling, jealousy, outbursts of anger, selfish ambition, dissension, division, envy, drunkenness, wild parties, and other sins like these. Let me tell you again, as I have before, that anyone living that sort of life will not inherit the kingdom of God. But the Holy Spirit produces this kind of fruit in our lives: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. There is no law against these things.
Did you hear that F word? It's freedom. Freedom. Freedom is the word. He actually mentions it a couple of times and goes on to explain what freedom really looks like and how it's a part of a better plan in terms of a better way to live. But actually, before we get into what Paul said, we need to actually wrestle with what that word means to us as 21st century Westerners here in Canada. Because here's the thing. Our country, the country to the south of us, our cousins, the United States, this continent of North America, freedom is literally baked into the foundation of who we are, as in our identity. The nation that we're a part of and our continent was essentially built in some ways, this is an oversimplification of the history of our country, but to actually have independence or freedom from crown or king. And we each fought battles to sort of get our independence that way, to actually create this space and this land and this place of opportunity, of enterprise, of freedom, of a new life. And it's not just actually baked into the foundation of our history. My parents were immigrants to this country. Perhaps some of you are immigrants to this country, or your parents' parents were. And part of the reason they immigrated to this country was, let's say, the free market, where, North American economics are based even on principles of saying, hey, if each person is free to pursue their own economic good to the greatest extent without hindrance from king and crown and whatever else, then they and the whole economy will grow. The free market is a big principle that underlies Western culture and Western thinking. Free enterprise, free market. But also some of our, like certainly the history of my ethnic background and perhaps many of your families came from places where your family or your ethnicity determined what you were going to do with your life. Like your family determined what job you were going to do, who you were going to marry, what culture you were going to marry into, and all of that thing, and even where you were going to live. And to some degree, many of us came to this country or value in this country, no, I can actually do whatever job I want, even though some of us are still kind of struggling to do something different than what our parents wanted us to do. Or I can marry whoever I want to, whatever skin color, whatever background, whatever. I can live wherever I want to. I'm free to do and choose really, literally whatever I want. This is baked into the foundation of what it means for us to be, what we see as to be human, to be truly free people. Is to be able to, if I can say it this way, like freedom is to do whatever you want. Whatever you want to do, it's fine, do it. Obviously the caveat we always put is, as long as you don't hurt anyone. That's what freedom means for the most part. I know it's an oversimplification, but I think that it's not an understatement to say this is probably the most important value for us as 21st century Westerners. Freedom is to be able to do whatever you want. As long as you don't harm anyone. That's the caveat. But this is actually not always what the definition of freedom has meant. Even aside from the biblical understanding of freedom, which we're going to get into. Listen to what Andrew Sullivan, who's a British-American writer, wrote for New York Magazine for a number of years, actually was one of the foremost voices in gay marriage and gay rights and was one of the first people to come out in journalism as gay. But listen to his observation about what freedom used to mean. He says this, for most of the ancients, that is the ancient philosophers, freedom was freedom from our natural desires and material needs. Listen, it rested on a mastery of these deep natural urges in favor of self-control, restraint, and education into virtue. They, that's the philosophers, would look at our freedom and instead see licentiousness, chaos, and slavery to desire. They would predict misery for us, not happiness as the result. He's basically saying this is not always how the world has understood freedom. In fact, some would observe what we define as freedom and say that will only land you in slavery, where you are simply a slave to your own desires, to whatever you want to do. He said the ancients, Greek philosophers in general, wouldn't look at freedom as just being able to do whatever you want to do. He says that they would predict isn't working and wouldn't work. And interestingly, even just this week as I was writing this message, some of the articles that popped up on feed, and certainly some of the research would tell us that we are possibly more addicted than ever. Whether like the clinical definition of addicted or just compulsive behavior as it relates to not only the age-old substances or whatever, but also new drugs, the opioid crisis, technology, pornography, gambling. We have new levels of addiction. So in a sense, in a culture that espouses freedom as being able to do whatever you want to do, that seems to have come alongside not increasing levels of happiness, but increasing levels of addiction. And 2,000 years ago, the Apostle Paul actually put his finger on this very thing. When he describes in this passage you just heard read for us, what freedom means. And here's what's interesting. This is not an anti-freedom message. This is not like a religious clamp down, you're evil, you do bad things, stop doing it, restrictive kind of thing. It's not anti-freedom at all. In fact, he opened, well, the part we read, he opens with in 13a, for you have been called, that's you, Jesus followers, have been called to live in freedom, brothers and sisters, right? This is about living in freedom. This is not anti-freedom. This is about how do you truly live in freedom? But he says, okay, but there's a way to do that this is not actually, freedom is not simply doing whatever you want to do. Because he goes on, he says, but don't use your freedom to satisfy your sinful nature. It's a perspective on choice and actually saying, yes, you do have the ability and the freedom to choose anything, but be careful, and you're called to live in freedom, but don't use your freedom to satisfy the desires of the sinful nature. In other words, there's such a way to live in choosing your freedom. And he actually begins to explain two different ways. And he says, one is just choosing to live by doing whatever your sinful nature desires, whatever you want to do. He says there's a problem with that, and that's not the way we're meant to live. Listen to how John Mark Comer in his book, Live No Lies, unpacks some of Paul's ideas in this passage in a really profound but simple way that helps us understand what Paul is getting at. Here's what he says. Paul used the word freedom here in the standard philosophical sense, like what the philosophers around in the ancient Greek world, as Paul was writing, sense of self-determination. Philosophers argue that human beings are the only creatures with self-determining freedom. Unlike the animals, we don't just run off our primal evolutionary drives for pleasure and survival. We have those drives, whether through evolutionary biology or the fall or some combination of the two. But we also have self-determining freedom, the capacity to override those drives when they are disordered. Think of an animal. A coyote doesn't decide to eat a rabbit or not. It doesn't see a rabbit and pause to consider, is this the right choice? You won't find a coyote reading a book on veganism by PETA or queuing up a podcast by Michael Pollan on a plant-based diet. Of course not. It operates by a very simple formula. See rabbit, chase rabbit, eat rabbit. It's just run by instinctual drives for survival. This is why there are no ethics in the animal kingdom. All is amoral, that means without morals, causal, and drive or desire-based. It's why we don't hold a predator from the local zoo accountable for eating its prey. But we are not coyotes. When we arrive at a restaurant, what does the server give us? A menu, not a live wriggling rabbit that we fall on and consume raw. We read said menu and weigh our options. We can also decide whether or not to eat a fellow human being through gossip, a lie, injustice, or a subtle reorg of our company to inch our way up the corporate ladder. This is what separates us from the animals, not our opposable thumbs or even our prefrontal cortices, but our ability to choose our course of action. This is because we have an enormous amount of self-determining freedom. But here's the rub. Freedom is very easy to abuse. And when we abuse freedom, we negate love. Comer really helpfully points out what the Apostle Paul is getting at when he says, hey, you can actually choose. Freedom is actually the power to choose. You can choose what not to do, not just what you desire to do. The sinful nature that Paul describes, Comer and makes analogous to in some ways perhaps our animal desires or animal instincts, and saying we are not simply creatures of desire. His point is that if we never deny ourselves, that's not freedom. It's allowing ourselves to be slaves to what we want, right? That's our animal instincts. If we never deny ourselves, that's not freedom. It's actually slavery to our desires. We are not able to say no to ourselves. And see, we live in a culture that says anything or anyone that tries to tell you what you should or shouldn't do, you should be suspicious of. Whether that's a religion or a government or an institution or a parent or even your own mind. Anything that seeks to try to conform you or restrict you or tell you you probably shouldn't do that thing or to limit your desires is somehow oppressive. Certainly there are our sexual desires. That comes from Freud, long history of philosophy there. This is not a new thing. It's a few hundred years in the making, but apparently it's as old as the earth. Right? That we're suspicious of anything that tells us to restrict, but that's not true freedom. To never deny ourselves is actually to become a slave to our appetites, to our desires, to our instincts. And so Paul says, be careful. Yes, we were called to live in freedom, but don't use your freedom to satisfy the sinful nature. And yet he goes further. This isn't just about denial for denial's sake. Repressing your desires for repressiveness sake, limitations for limitation's sake. He goes on, he says, don't use your freedom to satisfy your sinful nature. This is the second half of verse 13. Instead, use your freedom to serve one another in love. Love is the goal of freedom. Freedom is self-determination. That is what sets us apart as human beings. We are free to choose. And you can choose to just simply satisfy your desire to say yes to yourself all the time, but then you end up being a slave and freedom actually slips through your fingers. Or you can choose to serve another person in love. And if I can say it this way, the biblical understanding, certainly the New Testament understanding through the life of Jesus of true freedom, is choosing to limit ourselves in order to love others better. True freedom is choosing to limit ourselves to love better. It is actually to love others instead of ourselves. Think about this. Think about every decision perhaps that you regret. Think about every fall or fallout or catastrophe or scandal or something that you've witnessed in another person, perhaps in your family or in your workplace or just on TMZ. It isn't just the individual who's at the center of that who gets hurt, who ends up in a mess. There's always the collateral damage of what? People, the relationships, the family members, the spouse, the siblings, the children, the employees, the church congregants. Other people are damaged in the way. We say, hey, do whatever you want as long as you don't harm anyone. But what does harm really mean? It gets defined differently. And is it really possible to just do whatever you want without harming people? No, we are primarily, first and foremost, people who are inextricably connected to each other in relationships. What we do inevitably affects another person. It is impossible to just do whatever you want to do without anyone else being affected. See, even this list of sins that the Apostle Paul describes, it's easy to just kind of read this as, oh, a list of bad things. Don't do this, don't do that. But actually, if you think about these words, right, they involve hurt for other people, right? Sexual immorality, lust. What is lust? You know, when we choose to look at pornography or just look at a person lustfully, we are objectifying, depersonalizing that person for our own enjoyment. Something in our brain is saying, you know, subconsciously, you exist for my pleasure. I can use you for me. Friends, that is a destructive way to see anyone, and continuing to think like this. This is why a porn addiction doesn't just affect, you know, what you watch on the internet. It changes how you see people. Any kind of lust. Greed is the same way. When we begin to value things over people and we use people to get things, or we see people as people who can primarily help us get more money or who are not interesting to us because they don't have power or prominence or importance, and so they're not going to help me in my quest for me and self-fulfillment. We objectify people, we use them, and that ends up harming them. Same is true about jealousy, quarreling, envy. If you envy someone, you can't love them well. If you're jealous of another person, you're not really going to love them well. If jealousy comes into your marriage, your relationship, or your friendships, you can't love your friend or your spouse or your boyfriend or girlfriend well, right? These sins actually hurt our ability to love. That's his whole point. And he actually uses in this passage in Galatians 5 the metaphor of fruit. In other words, you use your freedom, or you choose your decisions in such a way that over time, things grow in your life. Whether envy, jealousy, quarreling, lust, rage, immorality, or these other things, which he says are the fruit of the Spirit, or God's presence, or God's desires in us. That's what's interesting, right? We have this sinful nature, our own base desires as human beings. But then when God's Spirit comes into our lives, he gives us new desires. The ability to desire and want what God wants, which is to want to love, to want what others want, to put others ahead of ourselves. And he says, when that happens, this other list of things grows. See, this isn't simply about avoiding a fall, right? And that's a good thing, to not end up in a decision, that the thing that we would regret for the rest of our life or whatever. This is about actually learning to love well. And he lists what love looks like. And here's what's interesting. Paul is borrowing writing styles from the Greco-Roman culture around him, and they often used lists. And that's why you'll see a bunch of lists sometimes. It's kind of like a rhetoric or didactic approach to like reinforcing a point. This. And what they note is that in ancient lists, when a writer would write a list, the first word and the last word, like the bookends of that list, were the really important words. And in fact, the first one was often like there was a colon after it, and the rest of the words defined that first word. Well, what's the first word in this list? What God produces in our lives when we choose to limit ourselves, what grows in our life? Love for others. Love. The first word is love. And then underneath it is some of these descriptions of what love looks like. Joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness. These are all of the descriptions of what love begins to look like in ourselves when we are willing to limit our freedom for the sake of loving others well. But what's the last word in the list? It actually seems like a non sequitur. Actually feels like it doesn't belong. What's the last word? Self-control. Self-control. Love and self-control are the bookends of this whole list. And here's what's fascinating. Our culture loves love. We want more love? Yes, but it hates self-control. What? Control of any kind. Don't even repress yourself. That's being oppressive to yourself. We want love, but we don't want self-control. And yet the Apostle Paul says, no, these two things go together, right? If you never control yourself and only always do what you want to do, you will end up hurting other people. The way to love others well is to limit yourself. Freedom is choosing to limit ourselves to love others well. It's using your freedom, this is the irony, using your freedom to choose to limit it, to put limitations on what we will and won't do. Friends, one of the most practical ways that I have seen this work out in my life, something that's been very helpful to me, and actually we've talked about at times here in our community, is language that we borrow from a pastor and author, Andy Stanley. And he introduces this idea of guardrails. Guardrails as in practical, helpful, specific limits to put on yourself. And he uses the analogy just to explain something we all kind of know when you drive, is that when you drive on the road, there are guardrails, on the edges of cliffs or ditches, or like big cement jersey barrier blocks between us and oncoming traffic, like on the highway. And he said, the thing is, if we got rid of those jersey barriers, if we got rid of those guardrails, we could actually drive on more of the road. They're in the safe zone. They're not in the ditch. They're on the road. In fact, hey, we could, if we had so much traffic, let's get rid of those barriers so we could fit 3 cars on a lane instead on the highway instead of 2 on that one direction. But why don't we do that? Because the guardrail, if you hit it, you might have a bit of damage from your car, but you won't go off a cliff. If you scrape that jersey barrier on the side of your car, you got a lot of damage on your car, but you're not dead from drifting into oncoming traffic and getting hit head on. The guardrails sit in the safe zone to prevent us from a fall or a collision we couldn't recover from. And he said, this is what we need in our lives. We actually need to put limitations on ourselves in the safe zone, things that aren't wrong or bad, but we choose not to do in order to protect us from a fall we could not recover from, and in order to help us to love others well. He said the problem is in our culture, in our freedom-oriented culture, we don't have guardrails. We just paint a line on the edge of the road. And we say, oh, don't cross this. Examples like drink responsibly. Well, what line is that? Because at a certain point, you're not thinking, your judgment is impaired. We actually use that word, and you cannot be responsible. So once you've crossed the line, it's already too late to realize that you're there. Or don't have sex till you're ready is a painted line on the road. Till you're ready or till the other person consents is basically the only painted line. It's like, oh, are you ready? Oh, did you consent? Yeah. Oh, I think so. Or I think that's what they meant. He said, that's not a helpful guardrail. Suddenly we've done something or we've crossed a line that we never thought we would because there was nothing protecting us from that edge. Or gamble responsibly. It's at the bottom of all these sites, or sometimes on the proliferation of gambling advertisements now that prop betting and everything is legal in Canada. It's just, gamble responsibly. But once you've got a debt, you're doing irresponsible things to get out of that debt. People know that's how the behavior works. And he says, we don't put guardrails in. We're so afraid to limit ourselves. We just paint a line on the edge. And he notes, we have a culture that baits us to the edge of that line. In everything you watch, every advertisement, every social media, every TV show, baits us to the edge of these behaviors, but then vilifies us if we go across it. Almost every TV show we watch has people having affairs and people doing things and people in multiple relationships and all this stuff. And it's all part of our media and we consume it, we binge watch it. But if you do that in your life, at least some people are going to say, what an idiot. Why did she do that? How could he do that to his family? Our culture baits us to the edge, but vilifies us when we fall over. So we need a better plan. The guardrails are freely choosing to limit ourselves, to not do something that we could do, something that is not illegal, not immoral, not unethical, and not sinful, but we choose not to do it for the sake of love and for the sake of protecting ourselves. We put it in the safe zone. Could we do it? Sure. Is there anything wrong with it? No. But is it wise to not do it to protect ourselves? Yes. Or something we don't have to do, something we're not obligated to do. We don't have to do something, but we say, yeah, but I'm going to do that in order to protect myself and love others well. We actually spent 4 weeks in the month of January this year talking about money. And there was a bunch of things, we didn't use this language, but there was a bunch of things we talked about practically during that series that are actually financial guardrails to help you protect yourself from a financial catastrophe you never thought you'd get into, and to love others well with your money. And if you missed that series, you can go back or you can listen to it again through the lens of, these are guardrails. And over the next couple of weeks, we're actually going to talk about what do guardrails look like in relationships and what do guardrails look like in our media consumption. And we're going to buck this, I'm telling you, because we live in a culture that says, don't limit me, don't tell me what I can and can't do. And I'm not going to tell you, I'm just going to suggest things. But it'll be helpful for us to begin to think, wait, I can't just say I would never do that. I need a better plan. Really, for the rest of this week, kind of before we get into this next week, and I'd encourage you to come back, or if you miss your way next week or whatever, to grab our podcast. You can find our messages online on our website at thewell.ca or on our YouTube channel, The Well. You can subscribe just to stay in this flow. But really, between now and then, could I just invite you to have a conversation with someone else in the room, or someone in your family, or someone that you've heard this, or perhaps a friend you want to send the message to and said, hey, I want to talk about this. And just this question, I don't think I have any, or perhaps I don't have the right limits in blank area. Like maybe usually there's one particular area of our life perhaps where we feel a little bit uncomfortable, or maybe you've been like having to think about it this week, or perhaps a spouse or a family member or a friend has been poking you about it since we started to talk about it. It's like, I don't think I have any guardrails, or I don't think I have good limits in this area of my life, just to begin to talk about it. Here's what I've found in my own life in exploring and putting guardrails in place. What it does for me is when I cross a line that I have put in place, it trips a wire in my mind. Now, remember, that line is not something immoral, unethical, sinful, or illegal. So when I cross it, I actually haven't crossed a line, but it's tripped a wire in my head, and I'm suddenly more vigilant and more careful, more realizing, this is not where I want to be. What the guardrail has done for me is, I think, it's given me, and I know it can give you the thing we need most, because just take for a moment. If you think about a decision or a season or a relationship or whatever you regret, or something you did or said, what you wish you had after the fact was just a moment before you sent that text, a moment before you clicked that link, a moment before you went to that place, a moment before you made that decision, a moment before you spent that thing, a moment to go, wait, should I really do this? And a guardrail trips the wire to give you a moment to breathe. And you haven't even done anything illegal, immoral, unethical, or sinful yet, but it trips the wire saying, wait a second, do I actually want to do that? We'd say, no. Use the analogy, I can back the car up and I can head back down the road, the one that I want to live on, the life that I want to have, the love that I want to see grow in my life for others, which actually is what true freedom really means.